source-based questions. So in source-based questions, you have civil resistance, the coming of democracy to South Africa, and the coming to terms with the past. Then we also have the end of the Cold War and a new world order from 1989 to present. So we are going to be using the sources. So in this case, for question 1D, we do have source 1A rather. The first source is actually source 1A. It is an article published in the Namibian newspaper on the 6th of December, that is in 1985. It explains the event unfolding during the conference launch of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which is also known as Cosatu. It also describes Cosatu's role as a labor movement. So going back to the question paper, we look at the first question. All right, the first question, it actually reads study source A. We assume that you would have studied source A, you would read the source before you attempt any questions. So the first question would read, why, according to the source, did the newly launched Cosatu threaten to call for a national strike? So if we refer back to our source, that is in paragraph number 1, you would actually go to line number 6. So let's go to line number 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we'll start it with from here. So I'm going to highlight where we take our answer from. I'm going to highlight where we are going to take our answer from. So it starts by saying leaders of the new Super Federation have already threatened to call for a national strike. If the government carries out its threat to repatriate or to send back migrant workers, and have pledged to organize workers in their homelands in defiance of any restrictions on unions in these regions. So the correct answer there will be to oppose repatriation or the sending back of migrant workers. So that's where we are going to take our answer from. So I'm going to write the answer right here, the suggested answer. So Cosatu intended to oppose repatriation. So say to oppose repatriation of migrant workers. So they wanted to oppose repatriation, or what I've explained is the sending back of migrant workers. They intended to oppose that. So that's why they decided to threaten to call for a national strike. Now moving on to 1.1.2. Explain why you think Cosatu supported the campaign for disinvestment against the apartheid government in South Africa. Remember, Cosatu was actually fighting against apartheid policies. So one of the methods which they used, they actually campaigned for disinvestment in South Africa. So you can actually say that Cosatu wanted to force democratic reforms in South Africa. You can say Cosatu wanted to force the government end apartheid. They wanted to force the government to end the racial policy of apartheid. So one of the methods which they used, they actually used disinvestments rather. They actually campaigned for disinvestment in South Africa. Disinvestment is when you encourage companies to pull out their investments from a particular country. So it's a method which can be used to achieve a political goal. Now moving on to the next question, which is next 1.1.3. It actually reads, define the term nationalization in your own words. So if you look at these two questions, they do not necessarily require you to refer to the source. they require you to define using your own words. So when we define a word, we actually explain our own understanding of the word, the word. So nationalization, it can be referred to the transfer of ownership. The transfer of ownership of resources the transfer of ownership of resources, or you can say of industry. It can be industry, whether it's primary, secondary, or even tertiary of industry, the transfer of ownership of resources or industry to the state or to the government. To the state or government. Or we'll just write it in short here, or government. So the transfer of ownership of resources or industry to the state or government is actually referred to as nationalization. It is when resources are controlled by the government instead of them being in private hands. So that is what we actually call nationalization. It is when a government controls resources or when a government controls the industry. It can be the farming industry, it can be the manufacturing industry, or even the tertiary industry, which is also known as what? As commerce. Now let's go to 1.1.4. What is implied by the statement that if Cosatu was committed to one person, one vote, a unitary South Africa in the context of its role as a labor movement? So what we are saying is that Cosatu wanted a democratic South Africa. That was their aim. Cosatu wanted a democratic dispensation in South Africa. In other words, they wanted a government which was made by the people, for the people, through. So Cosatu wanted a democratic dispensation in South Africa. That is the implication of this particular statement. They wanted democracy in South Africa. Or you can say they wanted democratic elections in South Africa. Wanted democratic elections. That is another way of putting it. So we have put 2 points then. They wanted, Cosatu wanted a democratic dispensation in South Africa, wanted democratic elections whereby people voted for them, voted for leaders. So you must bear in mind that during this time, there was no democracy in South Africa. People were not allowed to vote for their leaders, especially people who were coming from minority groups, people who were coming from Asian groups, and people who were coming from the African groups. They were not allowed to participate in democracy. Now, we are done with question 1A, or rather, I would say source 1A. We move on to source 1B. So the instruction says consult source 1B. If you look at 1B, we need to look at the source 1B. So 1B is actually a poster which was designed by Cosatu's media worker, Patrick Kokian, which demonstrates Cosatu's protest against the apartheid government's labor election amendment act that was introduced in 1987. So it actually reads no to the labor bill, no to restrictions. Then it also reads organize, resist. Then the words below read forward with Cosatu, Special Congress, Johannesburg, May 14 to 15, 1988. An injury to one is an injury to all. So that is how it reads then. So we need to respond to the questions which are stated here. Why do you think this poster was created? So you need to provide a reason why the poster was actually created. So one of the reasons which you can actually indicate is that the poster was created to mobilize support. To mobilize support. It was actually created to mobilize support from members. From members of Cosatu. Cosatu to oppose the reforms. All right, so one of the reasons why it was formed is to mobilize. To mobilize is when you try to get people organized so that they can oppose a particular thing which you are not comfortable with. Then you can also say that to garner support. To garner support from members. From members. It was actually designed to garner support from members. It was actually designed for that purpose. You can also say that to inform members. It was also designed to inform members. To inform members of the Cosatu of the action which they were about to take, which is in this case the strike which they wanted to embark on. So those are the possible answers which you can indicate on question 1.2. Now let's go to the next one. 1.2.2, identify evidence in the source that indicates that this was a Cosatu poster. So we need to go back or to revert back to the what? To the poster. So there is so much evidence from our poster which actually shows that this is a Cosatu poster. So one thing which I want to draw your attention to, I'll highlight it. We do have an emblem of the organization Cosatu on your bottom left corner. So there is an emblem which actually represents Cosatu. Remember, we can call it an emblem, we can call it a logo, which actually represents Cosatu. So I'm going to highlight it in what? In lime green. So that emblem, it actually shows that this poster belongs to Cosatu. In addition to that, there is also the slogan. This slogan, an injury to one, and an injury to one is an injury to all. It is actually the official slogan of the organization known as Cosatu. So we have two pieces of evidence which show that this is actually a Cosatu poster. So I'm going to write the answer there. So we have two things there. We actually have the emblem, or you can call it the logo. The Cosatu emblem. The Cosatu emblem, it actually shows that that's a Cosatu poster. Then in addition to the Cosatu emblem, we have the Cosatu logo as well. Logo and emblem is one and the same thing. Then we also have the slogan. An injury to one is an injury to all. That is actually the official slogan of the organization known as Cosatu organization. All right, going back to the question, the first question reads, quote evidence from the source suggesting that anti-apartheid groups were negatively affected by the state of emergence. So the term adversely, it simply means that they were negatively affected by the state of emergence. So the first evidence which we have, we find it in the source. We actually find it in the source. If you go back to the source, you'll find a part where they say that they had to seek the law. They had to seek the law in everything which they did. They actually had to obtain the law. I'm going to highlight it. Yeah, they will have to obtain the law and order ministers' permission to conduct any other activities. So if we try to simplify this, we can actually say that they did not have freedom to conduct any other activities. They needed the law and order minister's special permission to conduct any other activities. So they lacked freedom to conduct any other activities. All right, they lacked freedom to conduct any other activities. Any other activities. They lacked that freedom. They were not flexible. They were restricted by the state of emergency. Their activities were actually controlled by the state of emergency. Then let's go to the next question. Name 2 radical organizations that were of concern to the police. So our keyword there is radical. Radical, we are simply referring to organizations which are actually opposed totally to the apartheid government. So let's go back to our source 1C. You would find where they mention the radical organization. So I'm going to highlight where we are actually going to get our answer from. So the radical organizations are actually mentioned in this paragraph. In November, Security Police Chief Johan van der Meer signaled the possibility of such a crackdown when he told reporters that legal radical organizations such as the UDF, so they are related here, such as the UDF and Cosatu. So then radical organization, which the question is looking for, is the United Democratic Front, which is abbreviated as the UDF. So we have the UDF, we have the UDF, then we also have the UDF. In addition to the UDF, we also have Cosatu. We have 2 radical organizations, namely the UDF and Cosatu. So I'm going to write them right below the UDF and Cosatu. These are the 2 radical organizations which Johan van der Meer was referring to. Then the next question, 1.3.3. Why do you think the government prohibited Cosatu from campaigning for the unbanning of the ANC and the release of political prisoners? All right, just like the other question, this question requires your opinion and your own understanding of the context of the events which were taking place. So the reason here, there are several reasons which you can include. You know very well that Cosatu was an ally of ANC, and there were so many political prisoners who had been arrested, which were opposing the apartheid government. So release and the unbanning of the ANC would lead to the undermining of the power of the apartheid government. So this would undermine the power. This would undermine the power or the strength. It would actually undermine the power or the strength of the apartheid government. The apartheid government. The apartheid government. It will be undermined. It will be compromised. If the ANC was unbanned, it simply means that it would continue with its activities of opposing apartheid. So that would make the apartheid government actually weaker. So that's why they prohibited Cosatu from campaigning for the unbanning of the ANC and the release of political prisoners. Then going on to 1.3.4, explain the concept sanctions in the context of Cosatu's position in resisting the apartheid government. All right, sanctions are another method which was used by Cosatu and other anti-apartheid groups to oppose apartheid. I've mentioned disinvestment as one of the methods. So in this case, they're asking about sanctions. So when you talk about sanctions, sanctions are actually a political penalty. Sanctions are a political a political penalty. They are actually a political penalty given to a government or to a country. To a country or government. These are actually a penalty given to a country or a government for disobeying the law. It can be international law or it can be international agreement. So if a government disregards the law, they are actually punished using what we call sanctions. It can be economic sanctions, it can be political sanctions, or it can be social sanctions. So for example, I want to contextualize this now. The apartheid government violated human rights. It actually violated human rights. So the international community, other countries from outside, community imposed sanctions. Imposed sanctions on the apartheid government. Imposed sanctions or punishments on the apartheid government. They actually imposed sanctions on the apartheid government. In order to force the government to do the correct thing, they introduced penalties. So sanctions are a political penalty given to a country or a government for disobeying the law. So the apartheid government, it actually violated human rights. So the international community imposed sanctions on the apartheid government. Okay, now let's move on to the next source, which is source 1D, which is actually source 1D. So I'm going to flip to the source, which is source 1D. This source, it actually it highlights the measures adopted by Cosatu during its special congress in 1988. It was in response to the threat posed by the apartheid governments and restrictions and the Labor Relations Amendment Act. So the special, this is the source, that's source 1D for you there. Now let's go back to the question and address the demands of the question. All right. The first question reads, what according to the source were the two challenges that the Cosatu Special Congress had to respond to on 14 May 1988? So there were some two challenges which they had to respond to. We go back to our source. We go back to our source. So the first statement in the source, it reads, the Special Congress was called in response to two specific challenges to the Cosatu. Then there is a semicolon in them. Then immediately after that, the two challenges are stated. So the first thing is the government's February 24 restrictions. That is the first point, which legally limited Cosatu to a narrow range of factory floor trade unionism and effectively banned 17 other organizations, among them the UDF and a close, which was actually a close and a formal Cosatu ally. So let's identify our answers there. There are two challenges there's two specific challenges. The first challenge, there were the February 24 restrictions. Then the second one, and we also have the banning of 17 other organizations which were allies of Cosatu. So we are going to go back to the question paper. Then we write our answer. We are going to write it above here. We're going to write it above in different color. All right. So the first restriction, or the first challenge was the restrictions. The restrictions imposed on Cosatu. That is the first thing. You can actually call them the February restrictions, the restrictions which were imposed on Cosatu. That is our first point. In addition to that, we can also discuss about the banning of 17 other organizations. The banning of 17 other organizations affiliated to Cosatu. There were other 17 organizations which were related or which were allies to Cosatu. So that's why these are the two challenges which Cosatu was facing. The restrictions imposed on Cosatu, then also the banning of 17 other allies. The banning of 17 other allies, it was a cause of concern for Cosatu. So those are the two challenges which were faced by by Cosatu. Now let's go to the next question, which is 1.4.2, which reads, list 3 ways from the source which show how the Labor Relations Amendment Act would affect workers and their trade unions. So they were going to be affected in so many areas. So I'm going to write the first one here. The first thing, they were stripped of their right to strike. They were stripped of their right to strike. Where are we getting it? We go back to the source. As we read through it, you can find that there were so many restrictions which start in paragraph number 3. So I'm going to highlight the restrictions which, so the bill will substantially limit the workers' right to strike. That is our first point. Open trade unions to civil action for losses incurred or experienced by members. Then also, in addition to that, the restrictions and the bill attempted to deny Cosatu a right woven merged into the fabric of its own existence. Then the right to operate on a national political terrain. All these were part of the ways in which the Labor Relations Amendment Act would affect workers and the trade unions. So I'm going to write all the required points. So the first one is the right to strike. Then there was also the ban. They were actually banned from taking solidarity action. Solidarity action. The ban of solidarity action is one of those things. Then in addition to that, we can add the third point, which is actually the limits to civil action. The third point would be limits to civil action. Limits to civil action. So all these are ways from the source which show how the Labor Relations Amendment Act would affect the workers and their trade unions. Then moving on to 1.4.3, explain the meaning of the statement. Cosatu was denied the right to operate on the national political terrain. So we need to highlight the keyword then. The keyword there would be national political terrain. So what it simply means, this is basically a figurative expression. It simply means that Cosatu was not allowed to operate to operate at country level. Cosatu was not allowed to operate at country level. Or you can put it this way. You can say Cosatu's activities were localized. Cosatu's activities were localized. So it means Cosatu operated at a local scale instead of a national scale. They operated on the factory floor, which means that they operated in the companies rather than at a national level. Then going on to the next question, 1.1.4, comment on what is implied by the words Cosatu would not knuckle, or it won't give in without a struggle in the context of the threat posed by the apartheid government. Now, this question does not require you to consult the source per se, but it actually requires your own interpretation of the events or of what is happening in this particular context. So in other words, we can actually say that Cosatu was not going to accept what the government was suggesting. Cosatu would not reluctantly accept Cosatu would not reluctantly accept the restrictions imposed by the government. Imposed by the government. They were not just going to accept it. They were going to take alternative action. They were not going to accept it. And you can actually say that Cosatu became more determined. Became more determined to oppose government. More determined to oppose the government. To oppose government. So instead of folding their hands, they became much more determined to oppose whatever the government was controlling them on. For example, when the government took away their right to strike, when they banned solidarity action, and when they also limited their civil action. So they became much more determined. They became much more opposed to the government. Then let's refer to sources 1B and D. Explain how the information in source 1B supports the evidence in source 1D regarding Cosatu's response to the Labor Relations Amendment Act. So let's look at source 1B. Source 1B. Source 1B. Source 1B is a visual, it is actually a visual representation, or you can call it portrayal. It is a visual portrayal of the actions taken by Cosatu. Remember, it is actually a of the actions taken by Cosatu. Remember, it's actually a poster. A poster indicating that Cosatu members were supposed to strike. I would go back to that source so that you can have a look at it once more. Okay, as you can see, it is actually a poster designed by Cosatu. So it is a visual representative, or it is a visual portrayal or representation of the actions which were going to be taken by Cosatu. It reads no to labor law, no to restrictions, organize and resist. So that is the first source. Now let's go back to the other source. On the other side, source 1B, it is actually an explanation. Source 1D complements. 1D complements what is in 1C. Source 1D complements. It actually adds on to, complements source 1B. 1D actually complements 1B. It source 1D goes on to explain. It also goes on to explain why the special Congress was called for. It also goes to explain why the special Congress was called for. So what you can say is that these two sources are actually complementary. They support one another. They actually assist one another to portray the same idea of how Cosatu opposed the restrictions which were imposed by the government, or how they responded to the Labor Relations Amendment Act. Now let's go to the next source, which is paragraph writing, source 1.6. When it comes to paragraph writing, we must stick to the instruction which says that you must write in a paragraph. So avoid writing in bullet form, and also avoid writing in shortened form. So you must write in full sentences as far as possible. So the question reads, using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines, which is about 8 words, explaining how Cosatu responded to the government's labor reforms in the 1980s. So the first point we are going to state is that Cosatu opposed. It was not comfortable with whatever the government was stating. Cosatu opposed the reforms, labor reforms rather, reforms brought about by the government. It actually opposed the labor reforms brought about by the government. So according to source 1A, according to source 1A, Cosatu promised to take a tough stance against government, or to take tough action, actually promised to take a very tough stance against the government. Then source 2B, or source 1B rather, is a visual representation of actions taken by Cosatu, which means a strike. Cosatu to oppose the labor reforms. Remember, it's a poster which is actually inviting people to take action. That is source 1B. Then if you move on to 1C, source 1C explains, it actually is an explanation. It's an explanation. Source 1C it explains how Minister Adrian Actually explains how Minister Adric's actions affected Cosatu. Actually explains how their action were affected by the minister's action. Then source 1D indicates that the Congress which was called for was meant to respond to the challenges It was meant to respond to the challenges. It was actually meant to respond to the challenges spelled out by the Labor Relations Act. Labor Relations Act. Labor Relations Amendment Act. Act. So this is how our paragraph looks like. This is how our paragraph looks like. As you can see, it is roughly roughly of almost that length of 80 words or around 8 lines. So that brings us to the end of question 1. Now let's move on to the second question, which is question 2. So question 2, the key question which appears there is, how did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is also abbreviated as the TRC, expose leaders of the apartheid government for gross violations of human rights committed between 1960 and 1994? Then we are going to study sources 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D, then respond to the following questions. So we'll just briefly browse at the sources. So the first source, which is 1C, it is actually which is not 1C, it's actually source 2A rather. Question 2A, how did the TRC, the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission, expose leaders of the apartheid government for gross violations of human rights committed between 1960 and 1994? So we do have a source there. The source below has been taken from the biography of F.W. de Klerk, who was the leader of the National Party, titled A Question of Balance, a biography of F.W. de Klerk written by John Cameron Doe. All right, now let's go back to the questions. According to the source, why did the National Party support the idea of the TRC? We go back simply because the question is stating according to the source. That is our key word. So whenever a question states that according to the source, we should just do exactly like that. When you go back to the source, all right, in the first line, the National Party supported the idea of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in order to avoid responsibility. So they did it in order to avoid responsibility. So I'm going to write the answer right on top there. We get it from immediately when we get to the first line, that's when you get the answer. So you can say to the National Party supported in order to avoid responsibility for their actions during apartheid. Responsibility. In order to avoid responsibility. That's why they supported the idea. Now, the next question, it actually says, define the term amnesty in your own words. So this is a question which needs your own understanding of the concept. It's a historical concept. So amnesty can be defined as official pardon. It is actually official pardon for something which you have done, what you call it, for something which you have done. So you can also call it official forgiveness, which is often granted by the state. Ne? You can also call it official forgiveness or official pardon. For example, if you commit a crime, you can be granted what is called amnesty. So it is official forgiveness granted by to an individual by the state, which is the government. It is official forgiveness. When you do something wrong, you can be officially forgiven by the state. So we refer to that as amnesty. The next question reads, why do you think Black South Africans demanded explanations from perpetrators and not only disclosure from the National Party? So the correct answer would be explanations would help them get closure. So the first thing which would state is that explanations would help victims and also and relatives of victims it would help victims and relatives of victims to get closure, especially considering the violent and also traumatic events which happened during the apartheid era. So it would help victims and relatives of victims to get closure, or you can actually say to you, the wounds of the violent and traumatic past. And traumatic past. You know very well that apartheid was full of violence. So many people went through traumatic experiences. So explanations would help the victims and the relatives of victims to get closure and to heal the wounds of apartheid's violent past. Now, moving on to the next question, explain the implication of the statement of the Minister of Justice, who was by then Dula Omar, about the TRC to enable South Africans to come to terms with their past to advance the cause of reconciliation. So in other words, we're asking ourselves, what did the minister imply? What was he trying to say in this scenario? So you can actually, it's a question which does not need you to refer to the source as well, but it needs your own interpretation of what? Of the words of the minister. So you can actually say that the minister implied that the newly formed nation needed to deal with its violent past. It needed to deal with its violent past In addition to that, the nation needed to reconcile, needed reconciliation. The nation actually needed reconciliation in order to move into the future, face the future. The nation actually needed reconciliation. So you know very well that South Africa went through a violent past and traumatic past. So what the minister was trying to say is that there was need of dealing with the violent past, and there was also need for reconciliation, whereby people forgive one another, then they reconcile, and they start working on the future. So those are that is the implication of the statement of the Minister of Justice. Then moving on to 2.1.5, what, according to the source, were the opinions of the following regarding the granting of general amnesty by the TRC? So there are two parties which are involved here. The first was the leader of the National Party, who was de Klerk. Then we also have the ANC as a political party. So we need to look at their points of view in as far as the granting of general amnesty was concerned. So we go back again to the source. So when you go to the source, we move on to paragraph number 3. I'm going to highlight where we would extract the answer from. So the first line under paragraph number 3, it reads, F.W. de Klerk maintains that he was of the opinion that a process was required in order to enable South Africans to come to terms with the conflict of the past in a spirit of reconciliation. That is the first point of view. So in other words, we are saying F.W. de Klerk was actually in support of general amnesty. But now, when we go to the next line, the ANC has different ideas. According to the ANC, a general amnesty went much against ANC thinking. It is now common knowledge that appalling or terrible conditions, atrocities, crimes were committed in the name of state security, particularly in the closing years of P.2 Botha's presidents. So you can actually see the difference in the view here. ANC was against the granting of general amnesty, whilst de Klerk supported amnesty. So we are going to write it together, because the question reads, what, according to the source, were the opinions of the following regarding the granting of general amnesty by the TRC? De Klerk supported general amnesty. Actually supported general amnesty. The ANC opposed general amnesty. All right, so those are the two different viewpoints of the two political formations or the individual versus ANC as an organization. So that is question 2.1.5. Now, when we study source 1B, and let's have a look at source 1B. Source 1B is actually an extract from the book written by M. Meredith, who worked as a correspondent for the London Observer. So there is the source. Now, let's go back to the questions. Quote 3 pieces of evidence from the source suggesting that Botha's government entered the realm of criminal misconduct in the 1970s. So we're going to look for incriminating evidence which Botha and his accomplices had during the time of during the closing years of apartheid. So if we look at the source, we're going to look at some of the actions. All right, let's look at the first paragraph. All right, so there's the opening line, which I'm going to highlight here, which says previous governments yet ruled by repression. But there's something which changed under Botha's rules. You went beyond ordinary repression. So the first policy was the policy of killing the opponents. Then he was also responsible for the use of torture, abduction, arson, and sabotage. Then in terms of the terminology which he liked to use, he had used terminology like eliminate, take out, and wipe out. So these are the three pieces of what incriminating evidence which we find on Botha's side. So caught three pieces of evidence from the source suggesting that Botha's government entered the realm of criminal misconduct in the late 1970s. So we are going to respond to them question here. Three pieces of evidence. So the first thing is that killing political opponents, unlike other governments, Botha was responsible for killing political opponents. That is the first point. You would actually kill anyone who was opposed to him. Then in addition to that, he used torture. Also, you talk about torture. He actually used torture. He actually used torture against his opponents. In addition to that, he also used abductions. Abduction is when you take someone against his or her will. When you use force to take someone against their will, it's called an abduction. Then he also made use of fire, deliberately setting property on fire. We call that arson. Then in addition to that, he also made use of sabotage. He used to sabotage his opponents. He used sabotage. In addition to that, he also used use of words like eliminate. Use of words like eliminate. Eliminate or wipe out. This is evidence which shows that Botha was now responsible or was now entering a new realm of criminal misconduct. Now let's go to the next question, which is 2.2.2. Explain the term third force in the context of the apartheid government's way of dealing with the ANC. All right. The term third force is actually a historical term, which was used during apartheid, the time of apartheid. So it refers to third force it actually refers to a secret force. It actually refers to a secret force, or you can call it a secret militia. A secret force believed to be responsible for violence. A secret force or militia believed to be responsible for violence during the closing years of apartheid. Responsible for violence. For violence in the closing years of apartheid. So it is a militia, or you can call it, it was actually a secret force, which was responsible for violence during the closing years of apartheid. Then in addition to that, we are going to look at 2.2.3. Comment on why you think de Klerk did not act on the allegations made by General Steyn of third force activities. So this is our own point of view. All right, so one assumption is that perhaps Botha was responsible for the third force. He was actually responsible for that. He has been accused at times in some circles. He was responsible for the third force. It was actually his baby, or you can call it his brainchild. It is believed that Botha was responsible for the third force. Then also perhaps to avoid national division. Might have done it to avoid national division, even though other people believe that he was actually responsible for the creation of the third force. Then 2.2.4, who according to the source was involved in the bombing of Cosatu House. So if you go back to the source, we are going to investigate who was responsible for the bombing of the house. If you move on to the last paragraph, it actually says Van der Merwe had been involved in illegal activity regarding. So we are going to highlight this part. We come across, so it's Van der Merwe was responsible for the bombing of Cosatu House. Yet he could retain, he was actually a senior policeman in the country. So our culprit in this case, it's Van der Merwe. So it's Van der Merwe. Van der was the culprit who was responsible for such actions. Now let's move on to source 2C. That is question 2.3. We first look at the addendum and also the source itself. So it is actually a cartoon below drawn by the famous cartoonist Zapiro, and it was first published in The Sun Times on 2 August 1998. It depicts the apartheid government's cabinet ministers who evaded. To evade is to avoid. The term evade, it actually means to avoid. So we are going to look at those culprits who actually avoided. This is to avoid. Evade is to avoid. Some who avoided accountability for the violations of human rights committed between 1960 and 1994. So let's have a look at the picture. There is the vehicle, which is actually there. This is actually the TRC vehicle. Then we also have comments. Finally, a big one. Finally, a big one. Then we also have another thing. Another observer who presumably does Desmond Tutu. You should have seen the ones that got away. Then we do have other big fish involved in the atrocities of apartheid, namely F.W. de Klerk managed to get away. Adrian Flock managed to get away as well. Then we have P.2 Botha managed to get away. Then we also have Pick Botha on the image as well. Then we have Magnus Malan also managed to escape. Now, let's go back to the question. Explain the significance of the phrase, finally, a big one in the context of the amnesty process. Explain the significance of the big one, of the phrase, the big one. All right, question 2.3.1, it reads, explain the significance of the phrase, finally, a big one in the context of the amnesty process. So if you go back to the source itself, which is source 2C, finally the big one. If you go back to the big one, which is pointed at, we are actually looking at we are actually looking at Adrian Flock. So it simply means that this was one of the most notorious perpetrators of atrocities during the time of apartheid. So the context of these words, you can actually say that these words, or the significance of these words, that they simply mean that Flock was actually a major perpetrator in as far as atrocities were concerned during the time of apartheid. So I'm going to write correct the suggested correct response there. All right. The words imply that Locke was a major perpetrator, was actually a major perpetrator of atrocities during the apartheid era. Was one of the major perpetrators of atrocities. When you talk about atrocities, we are talking about cruel actions or things which actually violated the human rights of ordinary people. So that is the correct answer there. Then what is the implication of Tutu's words? You should have seen the ones that got away. So if you go back to the image, we do have Archbishop Desmond Tutu on the other side. Then there's a speech bubble which says, you should have seen the ones that got away. Then if you look at the images of the ones which are indicated there, we have the likes of F.W. de Klerk, then there's also P.W. Botham, then there's also Pick Botham, then there's also Magnus Malan. So now we go back to the question, what is the implication of Tutu's words? You should have seen the ones that got away regarding the TRC process. So if you look at those words, they actually mean that the major perpetrators, the biggest perpetrators of got away with their actions. The major perpetrators got away with their actions. Then smaller or less important participants the smaller or less important participants were the ones which went through the TRC process. The actual big fish, they actually managed to escape, but the less important participants went through the TRC process. Those are the implications of the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Now let's go on to source 2C. Would have a look at source 2D rather. The source is actually an extract which has been taken by confessions made by P. Erasmus. Then let's highlight this at P. Erasmus. He was actually a member of the security branch of the South African police. He exposes the dark secrets of the apartheid-era policing system ordered by the National Party government and the State Security Council in the early 1980s. Now, going back to the questions, what, according to the source, was Tom Leon's view of how the National Party treated its foot soldiers? All right, so you can actually say that the National Party exposed the ordinary soldiers. The National Party exposed the foot soldiers, but protected the masterminds. They actually exposed the foot soldiers and protected the master minds of them atrocities of apartheid. So they had double standards. They actually exposed people who occupied lesser important positions, but they protected those who occupied the most important positions. So that is how the National Party treated foot soldiers. Then the next question reads, why, according to the source, did P. Erasmus mention, I felt that old anger burning bright as ever inside me regarding the meetings between ex-members, ex-ministers, generals, and the State Security Council on how to deal with the TRC. So you can actually say that he felt angered by the actions of his former superiors. He actually felt angered by the actions of his former superiors. Felt the old anger rise within him. So that is 2.4.2. Now moving on to 2.4.3, comment on why foot soldiers felt thrown away by the leadership of the government that employed them. Some, they felt that way simply because they felt they were blamed for carrying out orders given by their superiors. So they were actually blamed for carrying out orders given by their superiors. So they felt thrown away in such ways, because they were now blamed for orders which they were rightly given by their superiors. 2.4.4, why would a historian regard this source as reliable when researching the accountability of the National Party leadership to the TRR process? So one advantage about this source, it actually comes from people who were from inside. It is an inside source. So it is reliable to a large extent. The source is reliable to a greater extent. Because it is actually a confession. Is a confession or testimony from a participant or an eyewitness. Or eyewitness. That is the first advantage about this source. In addition to that, one thing which can make this source to be of good use to a historian is that it also highlights key statistics. There are some key statistics which are highlighted there. For example, I would want to say 3,500 soldiers. Then we also have important names there. We also have important names being mentioned, which are of so much importance to a historian. We do have Van der Mel being, whose name has been indicated there. Then we also have dates which are mentioned then. So the fact that it provides statistics, we can consider it to be a reliable source of of history. So it contains the source. The source contains vital evidence. Vital evidence in the form of statistics. It contains vital evidence in the name of statistics. Names of people are also being discussed in the source. For example, when it comes to statistics, there's mention of 3,500 police officers. When it comes to names, we also have Van der Mel being discussed in the same source. Now let's go to the next question, which is 2.5. 2.5 will indicate it down there. All right, 2.5, refer to sources 2C and 2D. Explain how the information in 2C supports the evidence in 2D regarding how the leadership of the apartheid government avoided accountability during the TRC hearings. So we are going to compare two sources. So we start with the first source, which is actually source 2C. Source 2C portrays how it actually portrays how senior officials evaded from justice, evaded or avoided facing justice at the TRC. You look at the source, we can have one more look at it, which is source 2C. It shows how the big fish, the so-called big fish, or you can call them the leaders of or the architects of apartheid, they actually evaded justice. The likes of P.2, Botham, the likes of Big Botha, Adrian, Flock, and others, they actually avoided the justice system. So that's why we are saying it portrays, it gives a picture, it gives a visual representation of how some senior officials avoided being tried at the TRC. Then if we look at source D, it corroborates, or it actually it corroborates, or you can actually say that it complements. It actually complements, they agree, these two sources are agreeing. Complements source A, not A, but it complements source 2C in saying that it actually complements 2C. Source D is a testimony of how junior members officers were sacrificed they were actually sacrificed at the TRC at the expense of the cabinet ministers and high-ranking officials. So that's source 2C. Now let's move on to the next question, which requires you to write a paragraph of 80 words. So it actually reads, using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of 8 lines, which is about 80 words, to explain how the TRC exposed leaders of the apartheid government for gross human rights violations committed between 1960 and 1994. So you can actually say that the TRC, so we have to indicate the question, 2.6, and perhaps we might write it in a different class so that we can distinguish it from the previous answer. All right, the TRC protected, it actually protected. You can actually say it protected or exempted the main main perpetrators it actually exempted the main perpetrators of apartheid. It exempted the main perpetrators of apartheid. So if you look at it, you'll find that in source 2A, source 2A states that de Klerk supported the formation of the TRC. The formation of, or you can actually speak the policy of general amnesty, perhaps to protect himself. He actually supported the policy of general amnesty. Then on the other hand, we also say that the ANC opposed the ANC opposed general amnesty. Then looking at source B also discusses how senior officials got away with human rights violations. Then you can actually continue by saying that source C is actually a visual representation of the leaders who were hardly touched by the TRC. Then source D is a testimony, or you can call it a confession by a low-ranking government official bemoaning how they were let down by their leaders. So that is our paragraph. That is our paragraph. The TRC protected or exempted the main perpetrators of apartheid. Source A states that de Klerk supported the policy of general amnesty. The ANC opposed general amnesty. Source B also it discusses how senior officials got away with the human rights violations. Then source C is a representation of the leaders who were hardly touched by the TRC. Source D is a confession by a low-ranking government official bemoaning how they were let down by their leaders. So that brings us to the end of question 2. So now we move on to question 3. Question 3 reads, how did powerful international financial institutions, namely the IMF and the World Bank, shape the globalized economies in the 1980s? So we are going to refer to source 3A. You look at 3A. 3A, this is actually an extract which is taken by the book by Toyin Falola and B. House. It explains how globalization negatively affects the continent of Africa. All right, now let's go back to the questions. Going back to the questions themselves, the first question reads, define the term globalized economies in your own words. So it's a question which does not require you to refer to the source, but it requires your own words. Globalized economies globalized economies are economies or countries which are increasingly integrated. You can say integrated, which means the same as or connected. They are increasingly integrated or connected. They are more connected through the following methods: through trade, through travel, through communication, and technology. So globalized economies are economies or countries which are increasingly integrated or connected through trade, travel, communication, and technology. That is what brings those economies together. So now it says, the next question says, give 4 points of criticism, negative things of globalization as stated in the source. So we go back and refer to the source again. We look at the negatives which were stated now. All right. The first thing is that Africa is presented as unimportant, as marginal. It is actually presented as, Black people are presented as marginal. Africa is only, they are only there to seek resources, and global powers or economies seek considerable benefits from their economics and political dominance, the wealth of nations. Okay. Then, in addition to that, we can actually say that we can actually indicate how the criticisms of globalization. All right. So the first thing, when it comes to points of criticism, you can actually say that Africa is presented as unimportant. Is presented as unimportant. It is presented as unimportant. That's the first point. In addition to that, globalization benefits only. It only benefits only globalized economies. And in addition to that, you can also say that Africa provides use of resources from other countries. So the use of resources from other countries. So there is the use of resources from other countries. That is another criticism. then it only benefits globalized economies we have. Then also globalization is also accused of it destroys the environment. It also destroys the environment. So these are the three major criticisms of globalization. Now let's go to 3.1.3, which reads, using the information from the source and your own knowledge, comment on how powerful nations and financial institutions have benefited from implementation of globalization from above. All right. The first criticism, we'll find it in the source again, whereby it is indicated that Africa experiences globalization from above. Then, the actors who control globalization from above call for Africa to practice democracy, which they themselves do not practice. All right, let's go back. Using the information in the source and the owner, let's comment on how powerful nations and financial institutions have benefited from the implementation of globalization above. You can say that powerful nations dictate to poor nations. They force poor nations to implement democratic principles which they themselves do not. Do not practice. They force poor nations to implement democratic principles which themselves they do not apply, which shows the double standards. Then, in addition to that, let's go to 3.1.4. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain how experiencing globalization from below will be of advantage to Africa. So for this one, there are some other positive benefits of globalization. Access to markets. You can actually say that access to new markets. Then the spread of, you can also discuss the spread of spread of technology. You can also talk about spread to technology, then access to new industrial goods, also. All right. Having done the first question, now let's move on to the next question, which needs us to consult source B. We look at source B. Let's have a look at source B. All right, source B is actually an extract from a book by B.K. Campbell. It highlights the impact of globalization through the international financial institutions, namely the IMF and the World Bank, on African countries in the 1980s. Going back to the question, quote 4 pieces of evidence. Quote 4 pieces of evidence from the source to indicate that Africa's experience of the global crisis in the 1980s led to dependence with the West. Yeah. So we have the inability of Africa to service debt. It's resulted in dependency. So inability to service debt. Then in addition to that, countries actually go into debt. borrow from the West. Countries actually borrow from the West. In addition to that, we're also going to indicate that they borrow from the going to IMF. That's something which also shows dependency. Then we also talk about structural adjustment programs. Structural adjustment. All right, structural adjustments. Then moving on to 3.2.2, using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why assistance from the IMF and the World Bank was reluctantly accepted by some African countries. If you go back to the source, African countries, we get our answer from them. Usually they have done so reluctantly or unwillingly because they've exhausted other possibilities of obtaining finance. So our answer begins where the question says they've exhausted other possibilities of obtaining finance. Exhausted other possibilities. Other possibilities of getting finance. They would have used all the other possibilities of getting finance. So that's 3.2.2. Then the other question, or you can actually say that through desperation. This actually shows desperation. It is actually a sign of desperation. They would have exhausted all the other possibilities of obtaining finance. So they do it. So African countries or the developing countries, they would have exhausted other possibilities of getting finance, or they do that as a sign of desperation. Then moving on to 3.2.2, why do you think it is? Why do you think is implied by the statement? Not since the days of colonialism have external forces been so powerfully focused to shape the economic structure regarding the influence. So this is actually a statement which says not since the days of colonialism have external forces been so powerful focused to shape the Africa's economic structure. So what it basically means that the West and the financial institutions, the West and the financial institutions are more controlling than the colonial system, itself. They are actually more powerful than the old colonial system, which was associated with the occupation of Africa and other things. They've become much more influential in the developing world's affairs. Then the next question, explain the term structural adjustments in the context of the policies of international financial institutions regarding African countries. Explain the term structural adjustment in the context of policies of international. So a structural adjustment is actually, this is a set, a structural adjustment is a set of reforms. This is a set of reforms that a country It is a set of reforms that a country must stick to in order to get loans or financial assistance in order to get loans or financial assistance from the IMF, and the World Bank. It is actually a set of reforms that a country must stick to. In order for them to get money, they are given certain conditions. So you can call them certain conditions which they are given in order to obtain money from the IMF. Then now moving on to source 2C. If you look at 2C, it is a cartoon titled Dependency Theory, which was taken from the development of underdevelopment by A.G. Frank. It sheds light on the view regarding the dependency theory. So we do have the poor nations portrayed in that as the skinny men feeding the poor are the rich nations. So we have the rich nations represented as the other chubby, chubby character in the picture. Now let's go back to the question. Explain whether you consider the caption dependence theory as inappropriate to this cartoon. Yes, this can be an appropriate caption simply because it actually captures the whole essence of the dependency theory. Yes, it summarizes. All right, the caption 3.3. The caption summarizes the relationship between rich and poor nations, between rich and poor nations. Therefore, it is appropriate. It is appropriate. It summarizes the relationship between the rich and the poor nations. So in that case, we can consider it to be actually appropriate. Then let's look at the next question. So this is the answer for 3.3.1. Then why do you think the cartoon portrays the rich nations as oversized? The rich nations have benefited from the unequal relationship with the poor nation. The unequal relationship with poor nations. That's one way of putting it. You can actually say that the rich nations have benefited from the unequal relationship with poor nations, or you can also put it with this way is another alternative to portray the rich nations as being greedy. To portray the rich nations as being greedy. That's another reason of doing it. Now we are studying source 3D. Identify the two positions in the source that J. Stiglitz held before he entered the world of policymaking. So there are two positions which he actually held, two positions let's go back to the source. Identify the two positions which J. Stiglitz held. So the first, he was actually in university. So perhaps as a lecturer, he was actually an academic. He was actually in university. Then I left academia to serve on the Council of Economic Advisors. Then he was also an economic advisor. So these are the two positions which he held before getting into politics or into policy making. So you can say that he was an academic. He was an academic. All right, an academic, or you can say he was a lecturer in university. That is the first position. He served on the Council of Economic Advisors. He was an economic advisor. So these are the two positions which he held before he got into the job of policy making. Then let's go to the next question. Comment on why globalization is generally associated with development. Generally speaking, globalization creates new markets. It creates new markets. That is why it is associated with development. That is the first point. Then it promotes cross-border trade technology. Cross-border technology. It actually promotes cross-border technology. It promotes cross-border technology. So no wonder why it is regarded as the same as development. That's why it is associated with development. Then the next question, 3.4.3, give two examples of projects mentioned in the source that benefited from foreign aid. So we go back to our source, which is source 1D. And in the last paragraph, the second from last paragraph rather, you'd come across projects which have benefited from globalization. So the first one we do have here, it is indicated that water education projects, they've been, as I highlight, then AIDS projects. All these are examples of projects. So we are going to transfer them to our version there. So AIDS projects. Then we also have water projects. Water projects. Then we also have literacy projects. All these are benefits accrued from globalization, whereby projects have been sponsored so that children can go to school, people can get access to water, then the fighting of the HIV and AIDS pandemic. All these are benefits. Then 3.4.4, what is implied by the statement? But too many individuals